problem is they didn't have roles for these people. Like they had titles and they had experience in that title, but what they did at their previous place was very different than what they needed in the roles and the seats that they needed in their company, because their organization is very different than a typical product-based business. So how do you help people understand the role and role assignments, and what do you do as a consultant to help them see what do they actually need versus what do they think they need based off what other big companies are doing?
Yeah, I love that question. The example you gave is something I see very frequently. It is more common than one would think. And a lot of it has to do with a singular problem that I see all the time. When it comes to hiring and making decisions and giving green light, go, no go, I'm one of the most hated individuals, just because I like to challenge any person to do a few things before a hiring decision is given the green light. One is, what is the business case for that role to exist? And by business case, let's deep dive a bit into what that means.
Yeah.
What is the value that this role is going to add that you're not getting today?
Hey, welcome back to the show. Today, I have got an awesome leader in growth strategy. And Nahed, will you just give us a lowdown? Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah. Hey, Todd. Thanks for having me. So basically, I am an HR consultant who helps 7-figure companies go to 9-figure ones. And I do that by helping them turn what I call HR into rocket fuel for their growth.
I like rocket. I like rocket analogies. Get ready.
Yeah, just because, and the reason I think that's valid is because, a lot of times there's really 3 main buckets that help companies grow or even have the possibility to grow. There's the product market fit, right? You need that for sure.
Right.
You need to have financial sustainability in order to be able to grow. But those are things you can't control 100% for the most part. There's some market dynamics you can control, economic situations, political, so forth. The final piece of the puzzle is the people front, which you have full control over. And typically the people front in HR is an enabler. It is the catalyst for growth. It is not the only factor that will help you grow. You need the other 2, but without it, you hit a ceiling. And that's where I come in. Pretty much. And that's why I think that, hey, HR is that rocket fuel. It is that catalyst, that enabler.
Right.
If you pump diesel into a rocket, it's not going to take off. But if you pour rocket fuel into it, it is going to reach its full potential. And that's kind of how I position what I do.
Okay. So this is so relevant, you guys. If any of you have listened to any of my episodes, like more than 2 or 3, you're going to recognize right away there is a pattern in growth, and it repeats itself over and over in this podcast. And that is, it's always one of 3 things: people, processes, and tools. And I would say that market fit, yes, of course. But like the growth mechanisms are always right people, right roles, right positioning. Tell us what you see as the biggest problems, because one of the big reasons I wanted you on the show is I love people like you who identify this. Again, I think it's the number 1 growth prohibitor is people problems. So where do you see the most common issues that you solve for people when you come into their organizations?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you hit it right on the head in the beginning. Is when founders and startups think of growth and scaling and so forth, they think operations, they think, products and so forth. From an HR standpoint, I'm kind of aligned with what you just said earlier. People, processes, and infrastructure are the key drivers there. And a lot of times when you think of HR, you don't think of it in the breadth, especially the process perspective and the infrastructure perspective. But usually when I come into organizations, those are the first things I look at. Like, hey, how can we grow and scale with less people, which is probably one of the most un-HR things people, you can think of an HR person saying, right? It's like, hey, how can we do more with less? But scaling is that exactly. It's you want the exponential growth without having to match the headcount with the growth, or else you're not scaling anymore. Some of the biggest challenges I see in prohibiting some of these things from happening, one is the founders and startup leaders themselves, which I kind of call the hero mindset, trying to do everything and hoarding everything and trying to do everything from the beginning, and then just not letting go and not knowing when to let go. What ends up happening is you limit the growth, and you pretty much marry it to your capacity as an individual or a small team, as opposed to
Right.
trusting people to be able to leverage their capabilities and grow you as an organization. Um,
Right.
Something I see almost all the time with companies that achieve a certain level of success in the beginning is they try to
Yeah.
scale too fast. And by scale too fast, I mean that, hey, you know what? We hit $5 million in annual recurring revenue. Let's, put the pedal to the metal. Let's hire 50 more people. Let's introduce 3 more products. And, let's hope
Right.
things keep going upwards. But they forget that scaling needs a base for it to be sustainable. You don't build a skyscraper on the foundation of a 4-story building. You
Right.
need a strong foundation to build a company that stands the test of time. So building foundations, taking a step back, and to your point, the processes, the infrastructure, the right people, and so forth, without them, you
Right.
cannot scale. You're actually going to crash and burn. I've seen
Right.
companies who have actually bankrupt themselves with premature scaling.
Interesting.
It's great. It's wild. There was this one company, which was a regional IT services organization that I was working with as an employee way before I went into the consulting space. And it was one of the triggers that it was one of those light bulb moments for me, like, you have all these things going for you and you shoot yourself in the foot. So what happened is
Right.
that this company was growing triple digits for multiple years in a row. A lot of cash, great great product
Wow.
market fit, but on the people front, there were just so many lousy decisions where they managed to go bankrupt in 4 years from that point.
Wow.
I left way
So
before
so
that.
what
So
was it? I mean, we can point a finger and say people. Was it people that were making decisions that shouldn't have been? Was it like they just didn't have? Was it a group of buddies and they all kind of were like, "Hey, yeah, dude, we can figure this out on our way," or like, tell me about the specifics. Like
yes,
what?
yes, it was it
Yeah.
was it was a combination of many things. First off, it was the wrong people in the wrong roles.
Right.
There was an ultimate sin that I see in a lot of startups is the founding team that you start with that gets you to the first milestone, you assume is the one
Yes.
that's going to take you to the nth milestone. Whereas they
Right.
might
Right.
not have the capabilities and know how to actually go there. But what ends up happening is that ownership puts too much stock into their abilities where they're actually underqualified for doing that. And instead of helping
Right.
the company keep growing, they actually make decisions that make it tank. The third thing,
Yes.
which to piggyback a bit off of that, sometimes that specific company, what happened is that sometimes success blinds you. When
Right.
you're hitting milestone after milestone year at like 2-3 years and you're seeing this exponential growth, you assume
Yeah.
you're untouchable to some point and you can
Yeah.
do no wrong, and you stop listening to the feedback you're getting from your organization, from the people you hired with certain expertise to help you grow. And that specific company stopped listening to their teams, stop trusting the folks that were giving
Right.
them advice. And what ended up happening is they made wrong decision after wrong decision and compounded, and pretty
Yeah.
much they hit the ground. A lot of it was due with that specific company. A lot of it was due to expanding way more than they could. They
Right.
over leveraged themselves in terms of finances. They went into debt. There was a lot of things they
Right.
did, assuming that the growth trajectory was going to maintain. Like, yeah, triple
Yeah.
digits is going to happen forever, and let's keep going and keep our foot on the gas. And then they wake up
That's a
one day
horrible
in the red.
assumption to make.
It is.
It's such
It
a
is.
horrible assumption.
I mean, it's funny, but we see it a lot, right? If you look at what happened in the COVID pandemic, and you're not talking
Yeah,
small companies here. Some of the big companies we see in the news,
for
the
sure.
Amazons, the Googles, and all that, they hired like crazy in the pandemic, but here they are all laying people off just because, like, oops, we overhired. The demand
Yeah.
just didn't
Yeah.
sustain. So yeah, those are some of the things that were going on there. So it's a compounding effect for sure. You don't go from triple digit growth to bankruptcy in 4 years if there's a domino effect of sorts.
Well, I would have to agree. And the very first thing you said in that response is something I want to anchor in on for a minute, because you mentioned right people, right roles. Will you walk us through how you visualize a role versus a people? Because I see people confuse these a lot. And how do you help people identify that there's a match, like that
Yes.
there is a role defined, and that there is a person that's good at some stuff, but I need you to fill that role instead of just being the person you might have been in a previous company?
Yeah, that's I love that question. And generally speaking, how I start the conversation with any founder is, let's define what does the company need in terms of strategic capabilities that will help you achieve whatever goals you've mapped out. Okay. Hey, you want to get from point A to point B. What do we need as an organization to be good at and be able to do to be able to achieve that? That's step number one.
Right.
Those capabilities are going to inform the actual separation of roles and positions you need, right, in the organization. Now, of course, I'm not talking job titles here. I'm talking, okay, what is the composition of a certain function or role? Like if you want to place a person inside the organization, what are they going to be doing? What are they responsible for? What's their authority? What are the decisions they're making? So once you define that, then I advise looking at people and who's the best person to fill this. Because the reason I'm saying this, a lot of times founders get this in reverse. They try to tailor a role to the people they have or the person they think needs to be in that role, which is not the way you think of it. The way you need to, what does your business need and who's the best person? Not, hey, I have Joe here. How do I mold my organization's role to fit Joe's capabilities? That's thinking of it counterintuitively. So that's kind of I would say like the top level logic of how you approach this. And it's easier said than done.
And I am so glad you're here. And I just wanted to take a few seconds to tell you about a program that we have assembled with a lot of our podcast guests and a lot of people who are listening to the show who are feeling the same way that they do. There's a recurring theme. You'll hear a lot of these founders talk about, I couldn't have done it without my team. I couldn't have done it without a support group of peers. I couldn't have done it without having someone to talk to that understood my feeling of isolation as an operator of my business. You see, you're not alone. It is hard running a business, and it's even harder when you know you can't express all your deepest concerns and frustrations with your executive team. It makes them nervous. It gets them scared. You don't want scared people on your executive team. So where do you turn? The Captain's Council is where you turn. The Captain's Council, it is an organization that we are put together with podcast guests, as well as people who are listening who are in the same boat. You see, peers are the only ones that can give you the type of empathy, the type of advice that only a founder or operator know and understand. Go check it out at captainscouncil.com. I know you're going to love what you see there. We have put together an organizational structure that has small group settings, a global community of founders and operators, as well as monthly and quarterly in-person events. You're going to love what you see there. I can't wait for you to check it out and enjoy the rest of this episode. No, and it's funny you say that because, I recently, I would say in the last 4 years, I watched a company who is kind of local to where I'm at. They received a massive, there was kind of a big distribution, a big buyout. They went public, and a huge company came in, invested a ton of money in them. And the first thing they did was they went out and they got a new CFO. They added like 7 C-level positions that I don't think they needed to get to where they were at. But somehow they thought bringing in these high dollar people is going to somehow make all the difference in the world. The problem is they didn't have roles for these people. Like they had titles and they had experience in that title, but what they did at their previous place was very different than what they needed in the roles and the seats that they needed in their company, because their organization is very different than a typical product-based business. So how do you help people understand the role and role assignments, and what do you do as a consultant to help them see what do they actually need versus what do they think they need based off what other big companies are doing?
Yeah, I love that question. And the example you gave is something I see very frequently. It is more common than one would think. And a lot of it has to do with a singular problem that I see all the time. And I'll preface it with this. When I'm working with customers and organizations, when it comes to hiring and making decisions and giving green light, go, no go, I'm one of the most hated individuals, just because I like to challenge any person to do a few things
Right.
before a hiring decision is given the green light. One is,
Right.
what is the business case for that role to exist? And by business case, let's deep dive a bit into what that means.
Yeah.
What is the value that this role is going to add that you're not getting today? Like, if a founder
Right.
or a leader cannot pinpoint exactly what is the set of things that this role, we're not talking people here, we're talking the role itself. What is this role going to bring
Exactly.
to your organization that you don't have today? That's the first thing. The second thing, I'm like, what I usually follow up with is that, okay, let's assume for a second we don't even fill that role. What is that going to, how is that going to impact your organization? Is that going to impact your ability to achieve any of these goals that you've set? If yes, how? And if no, why? So if these two questions are answered, and they're answered very clearly and they're well defined, then you have a strong case for exploring filling a role or creating a role, because you're identifying a business need for that position, right? And position is not, and something you mentioned that I think is also critical and plays a factor here, is the assumption that a role as it exists in the market is exactly what I need is a big, big misstep, because a CFO, I'll give you an example, right? There was a point in time when I was the head of people and culture at a company, and I was also handling the IT stuff in the organization. That's not something in someone's HR job description, right? But it so it so happened that that organization needed someone who has a know-how to do basic IT administration and provisioning and deprovisioning of accounts on a very basic level. In addition to that, I happened to be someone who had that skill set, right? But typically speaking, that is not what an HR person does. So if you try and go to get any HR person, you plug them in, they're missing a part of what the business needs, then you need to add more headcount and so forth. So that, I think a lot of it is just taking a step back and reassessing, and not assuming there's always this false sense of urgency that growing companies fall into. Is that if I don't hire 10 people in the next month, the sky is going to fall. Well, no, it's not. You know, it's not. It's going to fall if you hire 10 people and 5 of them you don't need, then, well, your burn rate's going to accelerate and you're going to be in layoff territory pretty soon.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Interesting. Well, so as you look back at some of these companies that you've either been a part of or you've been consulting with them and helping them grow, like, are there key things that help you, like in your description and how you introduced yourself, you help take 7-figure businesses and turn them into 9-figure businesses. Like, that's a bold statement. I know it can happen, but what is it that you do specific? Like with the last few clients that you've had, what are some of the key things that they needed to change in regards to their people problems that did change and help bring about that growth?
No, yeah, that's a very good point. And a very valid question that I get asked all the time. Like, hey, you know, what's this HR person going to do with our business to help us accelerate? Like, this is just HR, right?
Right.
Something which I think is very critical that is missed a lot of times is I can't do my job if I don't understand the business as well or even better than the people running that company. What do I mean by that? If I'm looking at things from the HR lens, there's a superpower that HR has that not the entire organization has, except for the CEO maybe, is that if you are a C-level HR person, right, at the level that I operate in, you have access to all the data that the organization, all the levers that help an organization grow or not. You're talking about business financials, you're talking about people financials, you're talking about all the data that comes with it. If you're in operations, you're missing a piece of that puzzle. If you're in finance, you're looking at numbers, but you're probably not looking at, hey, for a product team to release XYZ features, I need 4 feature teams, a scrum team made up of 8 people. This is their velocity, and so on and so forth, as metrics that in people functions we look at. So the way I help an organization do this is that, one, I make sure that I understand the business so well to the point where if you put me in a room with any one of these people in the business, right, They will
Right.
think that I've come from that industry and I've been in it my whole life, even if I've never worked in it a day in my life. Right.
Right.
The
Right.
second thing is you need to understand how dependencies work in the organization. Meaning,
For sure.
if the organization wants to release 2 new products this year, you need to understand what are the levers that you need to pull to make that happen. Is it headcount? Is it more efficiency? Do you need to localize in certain locations? Do you need to open a branch somewhere? What does that
Right.
include? Do you have the capabilities and skills to even release that product that you want versus not? And
Right.
I'll end this with an example, like an actual example that happened, just to show you how all this ties together. So
Yeah.
I was sitting in a board of directors meeting. This was a couple of years ago, approximately, with a SaaS company, and this organization had like a 40% increase in revenues from the previous year from one flagship product.
Right.
So as part of the board meeting, I was an external advisor, so I was sitting on that meeting, and basically the executive team was presenting a strategy for the next year that included releasing 3 new products in addition to the progress that they wanted to make with their flagship product. Now, I had
Right.
access to their financials. I had a lot of data and metrics that I created around their velocity and speed and their headcount and their productivity and so forth.
Right.
Um, and once they were presenting that, and there was a sense of excitement, there was cheer, and the board of
Sure.
directors, was high-fiving each other and all that kind of stuff. So I raised my hand, and once they asked me, like, hey, what's the question? I made a statement which a lot of people looked at me as if I was, crazy or something. I said, well, I don't want to be the party pooper here, but what you're presenting is not financially possible based on the data I'm seeing. And I explained why, right? What I explained at the time is I looked at the headcount they have, the velocity on an individual level based on how they were going to separate the feature teams, right? Historically, how long it's taken them to build similar features based on the story points that they had per feature.
Yeah.
And I looked at the marketing, and I looked even at the sales cycle on average and how much that is. I'm like, hey guys, you can't do this. First off, you don't have enough money to build all these things because we can't hire enough people based on our current velocity. So there's 2 things that can happen here. Either we need to increase headcount to a point where we keep our current velocity, but we don't have the finances. We need to get external funding, or we need to improve our internal processes to the point where we meet a velocity of X to meet those projections. So
Sure.
I got the funny eye from a lot of people, but then once we talked about it a little bit more, like, you know what, this makes sense. We're missing a few pieces here to put this all together, and we ended up rehashing some of the strategy, and it was a hybrid between, okay, we need to fine-tune the manpower planning because we can't achieve the amount of velocity and efficiency that the numbers were saying in a 12-month period. It wasn't really possible. So it was a hybrid that actually worked towards the end of the day, and it was just from a little observation, just because of the people data that was there and the understanding of how to tie it all together. So that's a good example of how you can do something like this.
That's a great example. And I think that, a lot of people listening to this, if they're let's say you're sub 10 million in revenue, you just don't know that, like, you're nimble. You can be so nimble as sub 10 million.
Yep.
And when you're still in those 7-digit areas, you can be much more nimble because your team's not as huge. It doesn't take as much to direct the ship. But the minute you start to scaling above 10 million, it is a very different animal altogether. You've got potentially 10 times the amount of team you had at $1 million in revenue. And so at that point, you're like, okay, steering the ship is much harder. I don't have my hand on every single rein. I can't tug, and it just jerks its positioning as easily. So how do you coach people through this? And what that example you just said was a perfect case study of that particular thing. But how do you help them, especially with modern day tools, with AI, with I had a guy on my show recently who develops bots to do processes that humans might actually do. If it's, his theory is if there's 4 people doing the same thing, I can train a bot to do that and have it cost you, an eighth of what it might cost you to have 4 people doing that.
Yep.
How do you incorporate the modern tech with the people problem, how are you coaching through that? Because it
Yes.
can enhance their ability to scale.
Oh yeah, definitely. So one thing I always coach on, and especially with, to your point, the sub 10 million, and typically a lot of companies I work with are really sub 10 million. They're within the 7 figures, early
Yeah.
7 figures, and so forth. They're starting to accelerate. They're starting to, to gallop a little bit,
Right.
but they're not there yet. One
Right.
thing I always preach is build your operation and your business with the anticipation that you are going to scale and grow. Think from day one, whatever I'm building today, is this something that I'll have to break down and rebuild in a year? Or is this something that I can incrementally scale with up until, the nth degree? You're giving some great examples here, right? If, for example, that I need a recruiter who's going to manually review 500-600 resumes that come in every time I need to hire, well, how can I introduce some more automated screening, or introduce maybe like an assessment or something that can cut down the time and the effort from day one?
Yeah.
Because the problem with that is, what a lot of, especially I see this mostly with first-time founders, people who are serial entrepreneurs, they sort of get this after the first second. They're like, you know what? Yeah, I need to do things differently now. But especially first-time entrepreneurs, what happens is that they're trying to be cautious. They're trying to do, hey, let's do whatever we can to get by, keep our heads above water. But as soon as they start getting some type of success, they look back at the operation like, oh my God, there's a lot of operational debt that we need to fix. And it ends up slowing their ability to scale and grow. Even sometimes it caps it off for them. So for me, it's all about rewiring your brain and the culture and how you operate internally to think like, anytime you want to implement a new process, a procedure, build something, it could be something as basic as writing code and documentation. Well, am I writing code in a way that if someone else comes in as opposed to Joe here, are they going to know what's going on in that code, or are they going to have to spend a week just to understand what the hell's going on here?
Totally.
So build from day one with the mindset that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you scale. So if you're ready and you have the building blocks in place, then you are ready to scale when the time is right. But if you wait until the time is right to start thinking of scaling, you're already behind, and it's actually going to take you a step back.
I can appreciate this so much because, I've spent a lot of years doing marketing and even in roles as a fractional CMO with several different groups, in that right around between 8 and 20 million is kind of my where I pigeonhole myself a lot of the time. And I will say, there have been times where in marketing, it's like, try this, doesn't work. Try this, doesn't work. Try this, doesn't work. All of a sudden, it connects. And leads start pouring in, and the company does get overwhelmed because they don't have the right roles defined for what if we scaled? What if the magic recipe just all of a sudden clicked? Could we take this much, a 300% increase in sales in 3 months? Well, if you can't, then that's going to be a big deal. And so I appreciate you saying that. And I think that, probably right along with what you're saying is, understanding those roles, understanding that there are different hats that you may like to wear as a founder, as a partner, as a C-level exec in one of these types of companies. But should you be wearing those hats? And how quick can you deploy someone to take on those roles that you just don't have time to do every day?
Yeah, no, exactly. You've been talking about a few things related to speed, and I think that's an element that a lot of startups forget is one of their key competitive advantages, right? Regardless of, forget your product or service for a second and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
When you're a small organization, still, you're that sub 50 people, sub 100 people, you have the superpower of speed. You're nimble. To your point. When you pivot, you can do it very quickly. You can do it violently, and you'll see the impact fairly quickly as well. Totally. And that's something that founders need to leverage, because to your point, and I think marketing is an amazing example, because a lot of times in marketing, right? You don't know which campaign's going to hit. You don't know which strategy is
Nope.
going to, you have a good idea based on experience and practices, but you can't tell for sure. But what you do in marketing, right, is that if something doesn't work, you stop it, you pivot, you do something else. You don't write it out knowing that it's, you don't keep investing and sinking costs in something that's not working. The same thing happens across an organization's life cycle as a startup. When you're going to experiment, you're going to try things. You might have a process one day that, doesn't work. Hey, break it down, build it back up in another way. That's fine. Because when you can leverage that speed, the amount of learning that a startup can gain during a small period of time is amazing and tremendous, because by the time they get to the scaling readiness phase, they have learned and experimented so much where they know what works and what doesn't for their own company, and they can start running with it.
Totally. No, dude, I get it. And I think that we've hit on some amazing, like, this conversation could go for another hour, I think. But what I feel like the biggest takeaways I feel like I want people to have from this is understand roles versus people, because it's great to get a nice hire, better to have a nice hire that fits a role that they can come in and actually deploy and exercise their skill sets in. Secondly, understand your growth propensity. Like, if this thing did go right, how would I be prepared to handle that kind of growth? Because again, let's get real. It happens, and you've seen it where it tanked a company because they weren't prepared for the influx of what they were building.
Yep.
And then thirdly, just make sure that you align yourselves with people like you who can help advise them in these pivotal transition points. You mentioned 50 to 100 employees. Hello, yes, that is such a huge difference hiring after 100 employees. I've done it. It is crazy, crazy different stuff than me going and interviewing or my right-hand person interviewing. Now you're into the realm of, hey, Nahed, can you help me figure this out? Because I don't have time to deal with that. I've got all these other fires over here. So those are three big takeaways for me. What did I miss, Nahed?
No, I think you hit it right on the head. Something I'll just add to that, not just a recommendation, it's just, I would say, a mindset around all these things together. And this is one of the reasons why I even do what I do, is that I like companies to have a shortcut, a cheat code for getting to success without, again, the people portion of success is one of those rare elements that you can control from A to Z. You have full control over it. There aren't any external dynamics at play here. You have the A to Z control over it. And in business, it's anyone's pipe dream if you can control a certain lever or dynamic from A to Z. That is very rare to come by. So why not take a shortcut and do things in a way that are going to give you a better chance of success? Because at the end of the day,
100%.
Right, sometimes an argument I hear from a lot of early stage founders, especially, again, first time founders, is, well, we can't afford to invest in something like this or in, let's say, an enhanced operation or process this early. Well, the counter to that is, well, think of the opportunity cost you're losing by not doing that, right?
Amen.
It is a rounding error sometimes if you dig into the numbers. Really, it's one of those things where, like, that's fine. You don't care about it. So everything you said, plus it's really a mindset shift. And again, you need to operate with the mindset that, yes, we are going to succeed and we are going to scale, and you build from day one to get to that faster and sooner. But when you get there, you're ready. Yes, exactly. 100%.
I love it. Nahed, I really appreciate this conversation, and I think it's going to add a lot of value to my audience, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. So thank you so much for being a part of the show, and I really hope people will look out to you in terms of thought leadership. I know you've got a fun podcast. You've got lots of ways you're messaging this stuff. Links below in the notes here. Do take some time to understand what he's got going on, and think about your business, think about your people. And Nahed, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you. This was amazing. Thanks for having me. And again, love the conversation. And and anyone who needs more information on how this stuff works and just wants to, go through the journey that I take people on, to your point, follow the content, the podcast, reach out, happy to help folks. And let's help you grow.
Love it. Love it. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hey, I hope that was helpful to you. I loved this interview. Seriously. I do think the conversation could have gone on a lot longer. It actually did offline, and the comments were relevant. Like, it really is unique to see someone who's an HR consultant talk to the point of, hey, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't hire this person right now, because that's gonna increase your overhead too much right now. But think of the role. How do we fill the role later? How do we prepare? How do you know when the trigger point is to get that role filled? And these are the thought leaders that you want in your life. These are the types of people you want in your life, because when you are growth ready, you will be ready for growth. And so if you haven't done so already, there's my little plug for Growth Readiness. Check out growthreadiness.com and see if you're ready. Why are you not growing? Why are you not scaling the way you thought you could? Well, there's a good chance a simple assessment that's free will help you identify what that thing is. So check out the growthreadiness.com, take our assessment, and let's get you in a growth scaling pattern that's going to work for you and your business. Thanks so much for being a part of the show. We'll catch up with you later.